Welcome back. If everybody could have a seat, we'd like to get the post-lunch panel started. I'll stall a little bit and give you some bios for speakers. This panel has a lot more speakers than meets the eye. We have 4 papers, and the first is going to be given by David Herzberg, who's a cultural historian at the University of Buffalo, and who has written a wonderful book, if you haven't read it, called Happy Pills in America, From Milltown to Prozac. And if you don't know, remember what Milltown was, David is certainly the person to ask. And so he'll be speaking first. He's also done a documentary on race and housing in Buffalo, and he's currently writing a book that's, the paper's based on the book that he's currently writing. Our second speaker is actually a co-authored paper, and the person who'll be giving the paper is Jacqueline Johnson, who's an assistant professor in the Department of Sociology and Criminal Justice at Adelphi. Her research explores the disproportionate impact of the criminal justice system on minority populations in the United States, and the paper that we'll hear today was co-authored with Maren Curti of Rutgers and Klaus von Lamp at John Jay. The third paper we're going to hear actually, this is a team paper. And so we're going to hear from Helena Hansen, whose career is as stereoscopic as I can imagine. She's both an assistant professor of psychiatry and anthropology at NYU, and she is an anthropologist and psychiatrist herself, who studies addiction pharmaceuticals and from the viewpoint of the production of class, race, and gender, and has done a variety of field work in this area. And she is co-presenting with Julie Netherland. Julie Netherland is the Deputy State Director for the New York offices of the Drug Policy Alliance and an expert on the medicalization of addiction treatment. She recently had a book come out called Sociological Reflections on Neuroscience. And what is the one that we did together? Critical Perspectives on Addiction, which is another edited anthology by the tremendously energetic Julie Netherland. And the last paper is also a co-authored paper. It'll be given by Alex Bennett, who's a principal investigator at NDRI, and working along with Andrew Golub, who is also a principal investigator at NDRI with a considerably longer tenure than Alex. But they've worked together on a paper on veterans in New York City, and so we'll be hearing from each of those papers. And now that a few more of you have gathered after lunch, I'd like to go ahead and have our first speaker, David Herzberg.
So thanks to the organizers for the opportunity to participate in this great event. I'm on the policy panel, but I'm a historian, so I hope you won't mind. We're going to take a little journey back in time. The title slide, you can't see it, it's called The Old New Jim Crow, Prescription Drugs and the Drug War. No matter how many times he was asked, Harry Anslinger, head of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, always refused to take responsibility for barbiturate sedatives. Now, he didn't have any love for these drugs, which he thought were widely abused, but he insisted that as medicines, they should be the responsibility of the FDA, not the FBN, his organization. New slide. When World War II disrupted heroin supplies and desperate addicts began to inject themselves with barbiturates instead, however, Anslinger almost changed his mind. He sent out feelers to some of the culture warriors who had helped him criminalize marijuana back in 1937. Perhaps now is the time, he wrote one of them in 1940, to develop the background for legislation similar to the work you did in connection with cannabis. The war ended before this plan was put into place, and as heroin supplies rebounded, Anslinger's brief flirtation with FBN control of barbiturates ended too. Now, Anslinger's insistence on honoring this line dividing medicines and drugs, even as he contemplated moving that line, captures an important and enduring dynamic. On the one hand, it highlights how central this binary has been as an organizing principle in the history of drugs in America. And on the other hand, it highlights the arbitrariness of this kind of category, which have indeed been repeatedly challenged, redrawn, and transformed, with many drugs and many kinds of drug use moving back and forth across these lines all the while. Surprisingly, Anslinger's contradictory logic still structures much of the way historians and many other people think about drugs and the drug war. We still remain divided between those who study drugs and those who study pharmaceuticals, despite widespread acknowledgement that this division is a cultural construction. Historians of drugs have generally followed drug warriors in focusing their attention on heroin, cocaine, marijuana, and the urban racial minority communities who have suffered the most harm from their use and policing in the 20th century. And largely ignored in this kind of history is a much numerically larger laboratory of drug use and drug policy. I'm talking about the vast markets for prescription sedatives, stimulants, and narcotics open to those who could afford to see a physician and persuasively claim medical need for drugs. Study of these markets has fallen to pharmaceutical historians who have examined them largely as manifestations of the raw cultural and economic power of the drug industry. Today I want to suggest that we ought to be suspicious of this neat divide, which I argue warps our understanding of race, drugs, and addiction in America. So first, we need to take a quick detour way back to the beginning of the medicine and drug divide. Sorry, I keep looking over my shoulder just hoping that, why can't you look down there? No, that's not mine.
Yeah, that is not.
Yeah.
That is not. His
Yeah, if there's another, that's the one that's loaded now is a later paper. Okay, drug historians have done an excellent job in establishing the importance of opiates and cocaine as pharmaceuticals, as medicines in the 19th century. These were not incipiently illegal products just waiting to be purged en route to a more scientific and research-oriented drug industry. They were central objects of research, development, commerce, and therapeutics. They were a major part and purpose of the pharmaceutical industry. Now, after the Civil War, reformist campaigns to rein in the boisterous and dangerous drug market ultimately produced two separate regulatory systems anchored in two separate laws. And I have a really handy chart here. One, the 1906 Food and Drug Act required truthful labeling of drugs, and it was policed by a new organization, the Food and Drug Administration. The other law from this time period is the 1914 Harrison Anti-Narcotic Act, which criminalized non-medical use of opiates and cocaine and was policed by a different new organization called the Federal Bureau of Narcotics. Both of these systems originated in the same impulse to protect consumers' autonomous, rational decision-making about drugs. Dishonest labeling on the one hand, and addiction, reformers thought, both of these made it impossible to make rational drug decisions, so you gotta do something to prevent both. The result was a set of two binaries for understanding and regulating drugs. On the one hand, you had narcotics and addicts, and on the other hand, you had medicines and rational drug consumers. And there was, you can see, rational drug consumers are health-seeking and make rational decisions, and junkies are irrational and seek pleasure. This categorization was deeply racialized. In the early 20th century, white, native-born political authorities saw non-whites as incapable of rational, autonomous decision-making, what patients were supposed to do. And you can see this, for example, in the progressive era good government reforms that ended voting for freed slaves in the South and that limited the voting power of Eastern and Southern European immigrants in the North. Now, drug historians are acutely aware of these racial dynamics. When they recount the origins of the drug war, they are closely attuned to race, tracking prejudice against Chinese Americans, African Americans, Mexican Americans, and so forth. But this is only half the racial story that was going on. And when historians look at the origins of that pharmaceutical regulation, the FDA side of this, it's totally different kettle of beans. They never mention race at all, just political maneuvering by elite reformers on behalf of the public, this racially undifferentiated but presumptively white group of people who were understood as capable of making rational decisions about drugs if we could just make the labels honest. But the Food and Drug Act did not simply purify an already existing category called medicines by getting rid of things that were not medicines. Instead, it called into being a new category called medicines and a new type of drug user, this presumptively white rational consumer. As with all binaries, this category made the most sense when placed against its opposite, these junkies and narcotics users. Taken as a single system, both of these, the FBN and the FDA, were set up pretty much in the same time period. Drug and pharmacy laws look a lot like what Laura Wexler has identified as the progressive era's signature tender violence, or like May Nagai's portrait of immigration law. These were new governing technologies that rebuilt and reinforced racial hierarchies after the end of slavery. Now, early drug and pharmacy laws, which are usually thought of as totally separate stories, can therefore be thought of as belonging to that Jim Crow era. They established a privilege, maximal freedom of rational choice in a relatively safe drug market, governed at a distance by non-state actors like doctors and pharmacists. They established this privilege and then they linked it, both practically and culturally, to whiteness. Meanwhile, a parallel and far more repressive system provided riskier drugs to supposedly irrational and dangerous non-whites who were policed and punished directly by the state. By and large, historians still accept this century-old division, even historians who are otherwise the sharpest critics of the drug wars or big pharma. And the result has been two very different pictures of what is usually described as the classic era of drug control, i.e. the half-century or so from the first anti-drug laws to the reforms of the 1960s. Scholarship on narcotics during this classic era focuses on urban, non-white drug users and efforts to study and police them. It examines how racial segregation, international market structures funneled narcotics to non-white urban communities, and how racial bias helped authorities to see the resulting addiction as willful criminal acts to be punished rather than illnesses to be treated or social injustices to be remedied. Meanwhile, those people trying to understand modern pharmaceuticals during the same time period focus on drug companies' growing power, tracing Big Pharma's successful campaign to create a mass consumer market by influencing research, outfoxing regulators, and redefining illness and health. These create dramatically different stories. One analyzes anti-drug hysteria, the other analyzes pro-drug hoopla. One is skeptical of state authority, and the other calls for more state authority. One is critical of moral crusades against drug pushers, the other is actually part of such a crusade. One is written about urban non-whites, the other almost never discusses race or location. The separation makes what appears on its face to be a common sense assumption that there really was an inherent difference between medical and non-medical drug use. And a lot of this is based on a foundational historical episode, which is that when these laws were passed, historians tell us that medical use of narcotics back in 1914 plummeted, whereas street use of narcotics continued humming right along. So in other words, rational drug consumers, physicians and patients, chose to stop using drugs when the law changed, while irrational junkies chose not to stop using drugs. So these, it makes them look like different things. But on closer inspection, this reasoning doesn't hold up at all. And in fact, medical use of addictive drugs did not decline at all. For one thing, there are a variety of ways that narcotics continue to move from physicians to chronic users that I don't have time to get into. But narcotics were a relatively minor part of medically supported drug addiction in America after the Harrison Act. And that's because physicians and patients turned to new drugs, barbiturates, sedatives, and amphetamine stimulants. Now, barbiturates had been introduced in 1906, but they didn't really see mass use until Harrison Act enforcement became stricter in the mid-1920s. At this point, imports alone were 31 million doses annually by 1929. That doesn't count domestic production, that's just imports. Surveys estimated that barbiturates were in 15% of all prescriptions by the mid-50s, and that number doubles if you include other classes of sedatives. Amphetamines first appeared in the 1930s, became very widely used during World War II, with enough sold each year by 1945 to provide every American with 2 tablets per day, and the amount seemed to keep doubling every 2 years. With some notable exceptions, this mass use and abuse of sedatives and stimulants was overwhelmingly a white and middle-class affair, largely taking place outside of major cities in America. And these demographics were a logical outcome of the configuration of pharmaceutical markets, which were weakly policed, but which had powerful gatekeepers. By the 1950s, you needed a prescription to get these drugs, but there were no limits on how much or how often a doctor could prescribe. Possession without a prescription was not a crime. The law was enforced by the FDA and its tiny, overworked force of agents, or even worse, by local and state medical and pharmacy boards. Convictions were exceedingly hard to achieve, and penalties for transgressors were either minor or, in many cases, simply non-existent. Now, formal policing did little to stop mass use, it was quite robust in establishing gatekeepers who could ensure that drugs flowed mainly to the right populations. Doctors and pharmacists had great leeway in defining medical need for drugs and provided them mostly to trusted patients who looked like the kind of people that needed drugs. And ironically, the same thing was true for illicit pills. They tended to go through pharmacists and doctors as well, and to feel safe, they tended to provide those to familiar-looking people. A good example of this is a case, how this worked in practice, is a case from Muskogee, Oklahoma, which is not usually thought of as a drug war hotspot. But when FDA inspectors came to the town in 1948, they were looking for over-the-counter sales of dexedrine, amphetamines. At first, they focused on the downtown because that's where they assumed the worst violators would be. And after making a couple of cases, and it was in the newspapers, then they discovered, holy cow, all of the drugstores in Muskogee are selling over-the-counter, especially these neighborhood drugstores in middle-class neighborhoods, particularly to high school girls. And when they investigated these incidents, FDA agents were remarkably credulous. They believed the girls' claims about how much they'd been using, about why they were using. Even though the girls were contradicting each other, there was evidence of harmful abuse. One girl collapsed in a swimming pool. But they continued to believe that this was a case, for the most part, that these girls were using them for medical need and it was sort of accidental abuse. Their understanding of the incident was colored by the presumption that suburban white girls were innocent of any desire to use drugs for pleasure. Now, Muskogee was just one of hundreds of cases like this that I've gone through in FDA archives, FBN archives, and state medical and pharmacy board archives. And the ones that made it into the archives are just a tiny fraction of what was going on. And of course, this doesn't even begin to come into account for the legal sales of these drugs. You follow in a case and then the investigators discover that someone wrote a prescription somewhere along the way and they literally just drop the case. No matter how fraudulent the prescription, no matter what was going on, they have no authority over physicians. So this is another place where a whole bunch of traffic in these products is happening that they can't enforce. All this is to demonstrate one important point, which is that under the racially inflected auspices of therapy, the 20th century medical system provided an enormous volume of sedatives and stimulants for chronic use that in other circumstances would be categorized as abuse or addiction. So, in other words, white middle-class Americans did not make a rational choice to stop using drugs after the 1906 Food and Drug Act. They made a rational consumer choice to switch to different drugs. It has been no easier to stamp out white middle-class use of therapeutic drugs than illicit use of street drugs. And perhaps it's actually been harder. Use of street drugs waxes and wanes over time, right? But prescription sedative and stimulant stimulant use has grown relentlessly throughout the 20th century, decreasing only once briefly in the 1970s, as I'll discuss in a very brief moment. And now the experience of using street drugs and someone using prescription medicines was obviously very different in many, many ways. But from the vantage point of this history, these differences do not reflect a natural division between types of substances or types of people. They look more like an in vivo experiment with the same activity subjected to different policies and social contexts. Now, the two classic eras of drug control, and I'm sorry, I have a timeline that would make more sense. They came to an end right about when the civil rights movement began to challenge other forms of racial hierarchy. And the 1960s and 70s saw a turn away from strictly punitive responses to addiction. At the same time, you saw a crackdown on the pharmaceutical industry and their policies of advertising and marketing drugs. And the two narratives come together in a high point with President Nixon's 1970 drug law, which expanded treatment while also expanding punishment, and which also bridged the gap between medicines and drugs by putting all sedative stimulants and narcotics on a single schedule of controlled substances. State medical and pharmacy boards got more cooperative, especially as the DEA began to provide them with data about where drugs were being bought and sold that didn't rely on people reporting. Holy cow, I should look over my shoulder less. Let me wrap this up and say that that these reforms actually, for the first time in the 20th century, reduced the volume of sedative and stimulant use of prescription drugs. And there are tons of letters from white people in various places across the country complaining about an infringement on their rights by an intrusive state that was attending to problems that were really only existed in inner cities with their drug problems. And these silent majority voices were saying, what's happening to my access to these drugs that I need to lead a decent life? These kinds of complaints heralded a resurgence of a more conservative politics, starting with, as everyone knows, the 1973 Rockefeller drug laws, which on the one hand began this push back into hyper-punitive carceral state for street drug users, and at the same time the pharmaceutical industry rebounds with new drugs like Prozac, Xanax, Adderall, and OxyContin, all of which were hyped as technologically having resolved addiction issues. So, to conclude, we should stop accepting definitions of drug abuse that were coined 100 years ago by people whose agendas we do not share. It's time to bring back this large landscape of white people's drug use back into the story, and to be just as curious about when junkie-type addiction did not appear as when it did. And this can help us flesh out a diversity of experiences that can be masked by the single concept of addiction, and to explore a broader laboratory of drug policies. And it can also help us understand why it's so hard to rein in the pharmaceutical industry, because access to relatively well-studied, safe, and lightly policed drugs that make you feel good is a racial privilege, and like other such privileges, not one easily given up. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Today I'm going to talk about cigarettes. We haven't been talking too much about, when we think about the war on drugs, we don't think about legal drugs being part of that war. But I want to talk today about how the illegal cigarette market, oh, my slides are up, thanks. The illegal cigarette market can tell us something about the way we can think about the drug legalization, some of the effects of drug legalization. Let's see if I know how to work this. I don't know how to do this.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, help me. Yes, please. Yes. Okay, great. Yeah, thank you. So when we think about marijuana and tobacco, we can think about they might have some things in common, right? So we can think about smoking as a mode of administration, when that lots of people smoke both of them. We can think about plant cultivation. They both come from plants, and nicotine is a drug as well as, so it is highly addictive. So when we think about drug classification, but there's some key differences, of course. One has to do, of course, with legal status. One is legal, you can purchase legally, and the other you can't. And the one that I'm going to talk about most important today is taxes. That's the focus of my talk, because it has particular implications for the ways in which illegal markets work. Our case study is when we look at we look at taxation in the United States. New York State has some of the highest taxes on cigarettes of any state. It's $4.35. I know you can't read that at all. But followed by Washington State, which is $3.25, almost 3 cents. The lowest is Virginia, which is 30 cents, just as comparison of taxes on the 20-pack of cigarettes, followed by North Carolina and West Virginia, by the way, which is also very low. When we look at cigarette smoking in New York, we can see that there's a $4.35, but New York City has an extra tax. And so cigarette taxes on cigarettes in New York City are $5.85 per 20-pack. That's just for the taxes. So tax abatement is a key factor in the illegal cigarette market. When there have been some other studies which I will mention just briefly today that have addressed this. And when we look at an illegal cigarette market, we're talking about cigarettes that, since they are not illegal if you're of age, they're not illegal to purchase, but it's the ways in which you can purchase them that are illegal. So we're talking about situations where there may be no tax stamp, or if there's a tax stamp from another state or another country, or if it's a counterfeit tax stamp. Thank you. And so when we're talking about counterfeit tax stamps, we're talking about what we call fake cigarettes, right? So we're talking about illegally produced and distributed. So maybe I might decide I'm going to make my own Newports, which by the way I wouldn't be able to sell if anybody buys it, or another popular brand, or using substances other than tobacco. So, and when we're talking about the tax stamps, okay, this is what we're talking about. The one on the left here, which you can't see, it shows a Virginia, New York State tax stamp, and then what a cigarette looks like with no tax stamp. So previous research, as I mentioned, have addressed the issue of tobacco tax abatement as a factor in driving a legal cigarette market. Some of the findings from the New York State and New York City studies have shown that a large percentage, as low as 30, almost 25%, as high as 56% of New York smokers report some kind of tax avoidance, that they may purchase out of state or they might purchase a counterfeit cigarette. But we also have looked at some other studies that have specifically looked at discarded cigarette packs, which is what we also do in our study. And they found the similar findings that about 52% avoid taxes by purchasing cigarettes without a tax stamp, or in other states, or purchasing from other places outside of New York City, maybe upstate from the reservations. But Research Triangle Institute have also done studies, and so we find about as much as 58%. But they haven't included things like counterfeit stamps. They haven't sort of really looked at really where the cigarettes are coming from. So here's why South Bronx becomes a really important space to look at. It's in a way sort of a perfect storm of driving a legal market. It has high cigarette taxes, as I mentioned before. There's the $5.85 New York City taxes for cigarettes. There are also high rates of poverty. We have like 38.9% poverty rates. We have high smoking prevalence in the South Bronx. We also have close proximity to lower tax jurisdictions. So there's access to Virginia or even the Native American reservations where you can purchase untaxed cigarettes, and proximity to container ports such as Port Elizabeth, which would be especially of use to distributors in getting large quantities of cigarettes. So we studied the South Bronx, which was called the Litter Pack Survey, over the last 3 years, where we picked a random sample of 30 census tracts and collected discarded cigarette packs from neighborhoods, all of the streets in those 30 census tracts. Then went through a forensic analysis of tax stamps done by the Department of Taxation and Finance, and then again the U.S. Sheriff's Office, to see the legitimacy of the tax stamps. And that was, they have a special machine that allows us to see whether or not it's a counterfeit tax stamps or not. And so across the board, what you find is that when we look at, also one of the things I wanted to say, there was a law that was passed in 2011 to try to limit the amount of untaxed cigarettes that can come out of the Native American reservations. What we're finding is that there was a huge distribution of cigarettes coming from there, and so they created the law to limit, based on limit the number that they can sell. So what we see is in 2011, we can, just from this, you can see that this is a Newport market. South Bronx is a Newport market. That about 85.7% of the discarded cigarette packs were Newport. Then it went down slightly, came back, but it followed not very closely by Marlboro Reds, and then in negligible numbers by other cigarettes, especially non-name brand and untaxed off-brand cigarettes are just not popular at all. When we think about tax avoidance, what we find is that in 2011, we can see that about 9% were coming from Virginia, and then, but then by 2013, about 52% were coming in from Virginia in terms of where the tax stamps were, followed by, and then we look at what's in terms of New York State. Untaxed, we know that more in 2011 were untaxed, and that includes like things that might not have a tax stamp or counterfeit cigarettes, but were from New York State. But that reduced significantly by 2013. So what this tells us is that, number one, illegal cigarette markets are incredibly resilient. Within a year, they had distributors had people who are users or smoking cigarettes had already found other sources of where to get their cigarettes, and so that happened pretty quickly. So when we think about who might be stakeholders in trying to control the illegal cigarette market in South Bronx. We're seeing much more attention being paid to this as a problem. We're seeing, I'm going to show you some data, which you probably want to see here, about seizures increasing. But we know that the New York City Police Department has particular task force that have been designed to crack down not just on underage smoking, but also cracking down on establishments, stopping people on the street, giving more summons. We know that the New York State Department of Finance is very interested, the State Department of Finance, because what they're doing increasingly is charging people with tax avoidance in addition to criminal distribution charges. We have the New York City Sheriff's Office working with the City Department of Finance and the special tax teams to do both, to crack down on the distribution and to make sure that the city also gets their taxes. And we know that the tobacco companies have these brand integrity units that try to work with the Sheriff's Office as well to try to crack down on the number of illegal cigarettes. When we look at some of the spaces where they're doing more seizures, you can't see this, but the number of we did some data analysis to show the neighborhoods where the seizures are more likely to take place, and it's not a surprise. East Harlem, Washington Heights, South Bronx, and then again in Brooklyn, Bedford-Stuy, Crown Heights, Brownsville. That's where we're seeing more seizures. And so the reason why this is important is because these neighborhoods are where the illegal cigarette markets are likely to occur, but there are also spaces that are being heavily policed. So in addition to other kinds of drugs, we're seeing cigarettes as a factor here as well. So in my last couple minutes, let's just think about what we can learn by looking at the illegal cigarette market. Number one, high taxes and socioeconomic disparities increase the demand for a cheaper product. People purchase cigarettes overwhelmingly in order to avoid taxes. This past summer, we also did some interviews with smokers from the South Bronx about their cigarette choices, asking them questions about where they buy cigarettes, how they buy cigarettes. Overwhelmingly, their number one goal for purchasing cigarettes is to, number one, their addiction and desire for a cigarette, but also cost. They're looking for spaces to avoid the taxes. And so what we see is that high taxes, and it's very important to think about in terms of socioeconomics. And just one of the things I wanted to say as I'm running low on time when we think about legalizing marijuana, those who have called for legalizing marijuana as a way and taxing it as a way to raise revenue for states should think about what this means across the board. It ends up, you're not going to reduce an illegal market. You actually will, there will be illegal markets maintained because people can't afford it. People will desire it or in terms of cigarettes, in terms of addiction, they will try to avoid the taxes. Bootlegging is also resilient to these criminal laws. Within a year, as I've shown you, they had already found there were other sources of getting access to taxes. One of the things that we know, tax cigarettes, what we know is that the taxes vary across the states and within the states on a variety of products. So the likelihood is it would be the same for marijuana. So if you can go to another state and get it less expensive pretty easily, the likelihood is that people will, and they certainly do for cigarettes. Illegal cigarette sales we see diffusing from streets to legal businesses. There used to be the $5 man. That has changed significantly in New York City. Most of the cigarette smoking, illegal cigarettes are distributed through legal establishments. They're done through bodegas. People go and they don't even necessarily buy packs of cigarettes. They buy loosies. So that's another whole way in which this sales are being done. What we don't tend to do is think about how illegal markets work and what's driving them and the resiliency of these markets, and I think it's something to think about. And then in terms of another thing to think about is the stakeholders who work with police in attempts to control the illegal market. When I first started doing this research, I was thinking primarily about economics and what happens in poor communities. But one of the things we need to think about is what it means then when tax evasion becomes a part of the equation, right? We may reduce the number of summons on the street, but we're now talking about other kinds of crimes, and increasingly New York State and New York City involved as a way to collect taxes on this revenue. Tobacco companies also are increasingly working with the states to guarantee their product and to sort of reduce smuggling, but also they become a part of it. Public Health Department, of course, is involved here as they try to reduce the amount of smoking. And what we're also seeing with politicians, especially Bloomberg, a lot of this conversation around sin tax and the like, this has become a part of that. So we have to think about then what that might look like in terms of marijuana. Are we going to then say everybody's, let's distribute it like cigarettes, but are we going to still see the same narrative that we see with tobaccos around reducing, attempts to reduce consumption patterns, laws that might be passed in a way to try to control use, and what that means in terms of thinking about even taxation. So, and just to wrap it up here, some of the things that we just need to really think about is what this means. Sorry, I have a whole line here, but I especially wanted to get to this piece to think about poor neighborhoods. Consumers in poor neighborhoods are under surveillance for a number of drugs, and tobaccos included. Their illegal markets will flourish in these neighborhoods because there's a demand for a cheaper product, given the taxes and given the close distribution to less expensive markets. But that means then that poor consumers will have to deal with the consequences of illegality. The people that we talked about seeing establishments seized, themselves being stopped, and it isn't just about underage smoking. What we're seeing is this is in another part of the increased criminalization of poor minority people. Thank you.
Well, hopefully the cloud cover will cooperate here with our slides. I'm Julie Netherland. I'm a sociologist. I work at the Drug Policy Alliance, and my collaborator, Helena Hansen, and I are going to bring David's history of white prescription drug use a little bit more to the contemporary context. We're going to start in the 1990s and talk about the moral panic that really began in 2000 and continues to the present day around prescription opioid use among whites, particularly in suburban and rural communities, and the transition that's now happening from prescription drugs to heroin. And our contention is that to understand the drug war as a race war, you have to understand the role of whiteness and white supremacy in the existence of a white parallel, what we're going to call a non-drug war. So to provide some context, in the 1990s, Bush 1 had declared the decade of the brain, which brought with it an emphasis on pharmaceuticals as technologies of self-regulation, as well as the rise of the brain disease model of addiction. It was also an era of intense focus on individualized notions of personal responsibility and the dismantling of the welfare state. And in the realm of drug policy, what we saw, of course, was the continuation of the extraordinarily, so my slides seem to be advancing without my help. So excuse me just a second. Go back here, okay. So in the realm of drug policy, what we saw was the continuation of a punitive system for responding to drug use in African American and Latino communities, while at the same time the reemergence of a medicalized and pharmaceutical response to increasing rates of white opiate prescription use. So Helen and I are working on a larger project in which we're examining the ways that the prescription drug epidemic challenges some of the ideologies that underlie the war on drugs. But today we're going to focus more narrowly on a media analysis we did looking at portrayals and news stories of OxyContin, heroin, and race. And we're going to argue that when a drug epidemic is coded as white, we see a shift in how drug users are framed and treated. That is, drug use becomes a tragedy of what we're calling wasted whiteness, that is a kind of lost potential rather than a violent threat to society. We're further going to argue that when drug use is framed this way, it leads to different policy responses, in some ways analogous to the divergent responses we saw in response to crack versus powder cocaine in the 1980s. Sorry, slight technical difficulties here. Okay, so we know that there are generally few, if any, statistically significant differences in the rates of illicit drug use between racial and ethnic groups. However, We also know from scholarship on portrayals of drug use that popular and cultural images of illicit drug use are, in the contemporary context, most often of blacks and Latinos, and that there's a long history of associating particular drugs with specific ethnic and racial groups that stretches back to the opium dens, so-called, of the early Chinese immigrants. Now, researchers have also found that blacks are portrayed, obviously my slides are just going on yourself here. Sorry about that. Researchers have also found that blacks are portrayed as more menacing than whites in news stories involving drug use, and that media portrayals linking drug use to criminality are almost always about African American and Latinos. But something new began appearing in the pop culture in the past 10 to 15 years, an opiate epidemic that primarily affected white people. From 1990 to the present, we've seen an incredibly sharp increase in opioid-related deaths. They now outnumber traffic fatalities as the leading cause of accidental death in this country. And we also know that the non-medical use of pain relievers is almost twice as high among whites as it is among blacks. And not surprisingly, perhaps, this has received enormous media attention. And that's really what we wanted to look at. How is this new white epidemic being portrayed in the media? Okay, so we looked at a random sample of 100 articles from 2 time periods, and here's what we found. Race is seldom mentioned explicitly in news stories, but the words urban and suburban are frequently used as markers of race. That is, we're using place to mark race. We confirm this by looking at the location and demographics where each article was written, and indeed, urban was typically a marker of a predominantly African American or Latino community, while the words rural and suburban were marking predominantly white communities. We also found that white is an unmarked category. It's the assumed norm. And it's also assumed to have been free from drug use and addiction. So there was a very strong theme of sort of constant surprise that drug use is happening in white communities, even though we know that blacks and whites have long used illicit drugs in similar proportions. Here's a very typical quote. This isn't about inner cities and successive generations of unemployed addicts. This is about suburbia and rural America, Amish country for heaven's sakes, and middle-class high school students who have seen their lives unexpectedly derailed. We also found that drug use, whether in reference to pills or heroin, is really only newsworthy when it's happening in white communities. The only articles we found on drug use in African American communities almost exclusively were short arrest reports. And importantly, these included arrests for simple possession. That is, they were framing individual users as criminals. This quote may explain why drug use suddenly became newsworthy when it was happening in white communities. But it's a white problem now, an African American woman notes, adding that if it weren't, the camera crew wouldn't be here. And as we'll discuss, the stories involving white drug users and black drug users are very different. So one of the strongest themes we found was this one of wasted whiteness. And this is the notion that white users are portrayed as very sympathetic and tragic figures, and the tragedy is related to the lost potential of a life unlived. Black urban heroin arrest reports, in contrast, really just included the name, age, and charge, and very seldom any details about the person, their life, their family, their hopes, or their aspirations. There was no tragedy in those accounts, only criminality and threat. Whites, in contrast, were typically portrayed as our friends and our neighbors, and often contrasted to the so-called real addicts. These are familiar folks. This could be you. And clearly, the assumption is that the intended audience for these stories is a white one. And let me give you a very typical quote. I'm not talking about homeless, bum-looking street people. I'm talking about relatively affluent, well-dressed, high-achieving, Volvo-driving kids. Kids who belong to honor societies, who play soccer and lacrosse, kids headed to the good schools. And a related theme we found was the innocence of the white user. So unlike with the arrest reports we saw in the stories about black communities, in white communities we typically learn both how and why a person became addicted, and generally was framed as some kind of accident due to iatrogenic medicine. That is, somebody had an injury, went to a doctor, got painkillers, and then became addicted. Or sometimes it was portrayed as a young person who fell in with a bad crowd. As one article put it, quote, "They're good people who just had something go wrong in their lives." So the bottom line is that suburban white users are humanized, not criminalized in these media accounts. Okay, thank you. Another important theme we found was this notion of contagion. And this is really what's been motivating drug policy lately. That is, this transition that's happening, or that the media's reporting is happening, from prescription opioids to heroin use in suburban and rural areas. And heroin in these stories is portrayed as arriving from the inner city into white communities for the first time. And let me just give you a couple of illustrative quotes. Quote, "That's a direct conduit. They were using diverted pain meds, and the price got too high, and some switched to heroin. Suburban teens who fall into the trap of heroin use often drive to the west side to buy the drug." And finally, another quote, "People from rural areas are coming to the city to buy heroin and are the victims of assault." So again, the city as sort of a dangerous, violent place. Now these lines are crossing between suburban and urban communities. And now I'm going to turn it over to Helena.
So I'm Helena Hansen. I'm a psychiatrist and anthropologist at NYU, and I'm going to talk about the policy implications of this war on drugs that wasn't, as we're calling it. The decriminalized, medicalized white space of prescription opioid addiction. This is based not only on the media analysis that Julie presented, but also on our multi-level study of what Julie and I call the technologies of whiteness. And these are designed to keep prescription opioids white. They include, let's see, well, you may be able to read that. Okay, there's the neuroscientific model of addiction as a brain disease promoted as a part of the NIH's Decade of the Brain, a model that claims to universalize and democratize addiction through a biological model of causation, but has, in practice, supported a white medicalized response to prescription opioid addiction while leaving the war on drugs intact. And then the second is new biotechnologies such as tamper-resistant OxyContin formulations and buprenorphine/Suboxone, which some of you may have heard of, the opioid that the FDA approved for use in private offices in treating opiate addiction as an alternative to methadone, which is available primarily to whites with private insurance. And then third, regulatory innovations for prescription opioids involving surveillance of and limitations on prescribers of opioids for either pain or for private office treatment of opioid addiction. And then fourth, the exclusive marketing of prescription opioids and buprenorphine/Suboxone to a white middle-class clientele using internet ads and internet-based prescriber referral services. So these technologies of whiteness pose a policy paradox. Public support for narcotics policy has rested on othering. The crack epidemic as black and distinct from white powder cocaine, for example, making minimum sentence for crack possession appealing to white voters. We have never seen white drug users who are the majority of drug users incarcerated in the same proportions as blacks or Latinos. But now the numbers and deaths of prescription opioids due to prescription opioids are so high, with prescription opioids outstripping heroin as the major opiate of abuse in the US, and high school students reporting more frequent prescription opiate use than marijuana use, that a policy response is demanded. But if the user is white, portrayed as blameless, and their arrest would desegregate drug policy, how are policymakers to respond? Our media analysis indicates that the public response for opiate abuse clearly differs by race. One is that stories on urban heroin use in our sample almost exclusively reported arrests. Articles on suburban heroin use mentioned treatment, drug courts, education, and crackdowns on traffickers. None of them mentioned incarceration. And then articles on suburban prescription opioid use mentioned prevention, education, treatment, drug take-back programs, and emphasized crackdowns on prescribing doctors rather than on users. Bear in mind that while prescription opiate abuse is now more common than heroin use in the US, the arrest rate for heroin is 5 times the arrest rate for prescription drugs. So what we see in this new landscape is a focus on the drug supplier or dealer, in this case the doctor. As one article read, when opioid supplies are restricted, users will turn to friends or dirty doctors to get more. We argue that doctors are a target of exclusion. Consider that the drug user in these stories is morally blameless, a nice white person next door, and needs to be protected from the black and brown drug war. So users, white users in this case, are unavailable as targets for drug control. And despite its aggressive marketing, Big Pharma is also beyond the political reach of American politicians, although we did see a few articles, a few stories point to the role of pharmaceutical companies. If anyone is to be criminalized, it is the doctors who don't follow protocol, are too liberal, or who are profit-mongering foreign medical graduates in Florida pain clinics. In our media sample, there were many stories villainizing the unscrupulous doctor, who, more often than not, was a foreign-born person of color. Quote, a 25-year-old patient told the investigator that Dr. Acosta hooked her on OxyContin after an April 2000 office visit. Instead of addressing the addiction, Acosta helped the patient inject the drug to get high. And then one Trinidadian-born doctor was reported to be charged with murder in the case of an OxyContin overdose death. This leaves us with prescriber-focused policy responses. Crackdowns on pill mill prescribers, surveillance through prescription monitoring programs, and further restrictions on and regulation of prescribers. All target doctors and all serve to constrain physician autonomy. So we've seen this focus on restricting doctors before. In the early 1900s, there were growing concerns about the availability of addictive substances in medicines, particularly cocaine, heroin, and morphine. This led to the passage of the Harrison Act, restricted the availability of narcotic medications, and prohibited doctors from prescribing any narcotic for the treatment of addiction. That is to say, it became illegal to maintain someone on narcotics that was physically dependent. And this forced patients into the illicit market that the law itself created. So this was the beginning of prohibition, and it started in large part in response to prescription medications exactly 1 century ago. Just like the 1914 Harrison Act, the contemporary policy response to prescription opiate abuse involves restriction of licit opioids and physicians' ability to prescribe them, large populations of patients who are addicted in the course of medical treatment, and arrests of doctors who use prescription opioids to maintain addicted patients. Doctors then are left with little flexibility to take harm reduction approaches, such as maintenance to keep patients from using illegal supplies. And doctors who do not engage in surveillance of their patients can have their license taken away by new prescription monitoring programs like the one that just went into effect in New York State, iStop, which I myself am in the process of registering for, and it levies significant sanctions against non-compliant doctors. This leaves even quote-unquote legitimate pain patients to go to illicit markets. And as we are seeing in news reports of prescription opiate users who turn to heroin after crackdowns on OxyContin prescribers, this is indeed taking place now. So what we find in our media analysis is that race is coded as place in both language and geography. Not surprisingly, the publicity and policy of opioid addiction is designed to maintain those places as separate. The language of contagion in articles about suburban prescription opioid users transitioning to urban heroin indicates that geographic, social, and symbolic segregation is at stake. It also shows how important the maintenance of a protected white space for drug use is to the continuation of a punitive response to black and brown drug use. So ironically, the efforts of drug policymakers to safeguard the whiteness of prescription drugs through biotechnology and especially monitoring of doctors has created a policy paradox forcing an unanticipated result in the miscegenation of race and place. To bring that point home, I'll close with a 15-second NBC News clip, which opens with a story of a white Chicago police chief whose teenage son was found dead of overdose in his suburban home. And it ends with this story. I wonder if I could have the clip now. Thank you. And it should start at 1:15, 1 minute, 15 seconds.
It's your turn to bring something to the table. Meet the press on Facebook.
Okay, we lost our cue. Are you able to bring it up?
The conversation continues every Sunday and every day.
Last night,
Close enough.
Close your eyes and picture what a heroin addict looks like. And then open your eyes and see our family.
Mary Diedrich's daughter, Alyssa, was a figure skater and cheerleader in suburban Boston. Alyssa was about 14 when she started taking prescription drugs like OxyContin. Her senior year, she realized heroin was cheaper.
I had promised myself that as long as I never did heroin, I would be okay. You know, that I wasn't that bad yet. I cried right before sniffing my first line of heroin.
Alyssa left home for weeks at a time.
Thank you. I just want to thank one of our media analysts who's in the audience, Denise DeRocco.
Okay, thank everybody, and I want to thank the organizers, and I really want to thank all of the veterans who are continuing to work with us in our projects, both in our studies as well as throughout the community. Without everybody, this project would not be happening. So today, and I also want to thank Andy, who's a collaborator in this, and Gary Huggins, who's one of our excellent veteran research assistants, and Luther Elliott, who's one of our great ethnographers. My talk today is called The Veterans' Challenges in the Face of the Ongoing War on Drugs. In the past decade, roughly 2 million veterans have returned to the States, having served in Iraq and Afghanistan. Many of these veterans come home with chronic pain, memories of conflict. Many endure PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, traumatic brain injury, depression, anxiety. These challenges are really exacerbated by larger readjustment challenges, finding stable housing, work, employment, a sense of wholeness after conflict and trauma. In today's presentation, I'm going to really just address 3 of the many challenges veterans face in relation to the war on drugs. First, first, there's this balancing act. Many veterans endure chronic. Oh, I'm sorry. Yes.
Either you or the microphone.
Okay. Okay, great. Can people hear me now? Okay, thank you. First, in many ways, it's a balancing act. Many veterans return with non-cancerous chronic pain. Opioids help out in myriad ways. By the same token, it is very easy to accidentally misuse an opioid, and this has resulted in, we're hearing it all the time, an overdose, suicide, accident. Second, some veterans with PTSD and TBI are rejecting prescription drugs and are self-medicating with marijuana. Third, veterans with PTSD and other mental health challenges are potentially at heightened risk for adverse consequences when dealing with law enforcement, family, school. So today I'm going to be drawing on 2 studies, an ethnographic study and an ongoing longitudinal study working with 270 veterans, really looking at the challenges they face with regards to substance use misuse, as well as the complex of mental health and social adjustment challenges. I wanted to go back a little bit. We have some great historians here, and then drawing on the works of people like David Courtwright, Dark Paradise, Nicholas Rasmussen on Speed, The Many Lives of Amphetamine, and more recently, Daga Bergen Chico, Drugs and War. There's always been a link between drugs, military personnel, and veterans, however perceived or real. And here I just wanted to point out the obvious: coffee, stimulants. From the Civil War, people are using coffee to go, as well as alcohol. Alcohol is consistent in the pharmacopoeia of military veterans and active personnel to deal with pain, boredom, recreation. In the Civil War, obviously, we had the use of morphine for some administered via the hypodermic syringe, as well as opium tablets for diarrhea, things such as that, as well as marijuana for pain, medical marijuana in this early period. And then with World War II, benzodrine tablets, amphetamine tablets introduced amongst military personnel. And then we have, obviously, Vietnam, marijuana, heroin.
Still can't hear it.
Oh, I'm sorry. I apologize. And then with Vietnam, obviously, we have heroin and marijuana amongst wide-ranging other drugs. This recent conflict has been really associated with prescription drugs. Opioids, Vicodin, Percocet, Oxycontin, as well as Paxil, Zoloft, Xanax, other benzos. A little background. I mean, I think now that we pretty much almost every day there's newspaper reports of many of the challenges that veterans are facing. But I wanted to just point out a few things here. One, due to advances in medicine, military personnel are surviving battlefield injuries. Many are surviving longer, but many are coming home with long-term chronic pain. Among active duty personnel, drug toxicity deaths more than doubled between 2006 and 2011. 68% of all prescription medications, only 48% of those people had prescriptions for them. 48% of OEF veterans within 1 year of entering the VA medical system are diagnosed with a chronic pain disorder. 69% have screened positive for mental health problems. The most prevalent diagnosis is PTSD. And quickly here through this slide, as in other conflicts, these prescription drugs are used for pain, mental health challenges, performance enhancing, go, no-go. They're used for sleep. They're used strategic. Some people smoke marijuana to try to get kicked out of the military. Post-service, arguably these challenges are exasperated by the host of things that veterans deal with. Unemployment, homelessness, poverty, social isolation, stigma of not being successful, stigma, fear of being perceived as vulnerable, preventing many from seeking help. Now here I have, based on our larger study, which is ongoing, I present some baseline data looking at veterans' drug and alcohol use before they were in the military, while in the military, during their deployment, and the past 30 days. I want to point out three main things here. One, you see about a little over half of the population were using marijuana before they entered the military. That declines to about 20% once they're in the military. On the other hand, alcohol use, heavy alcohol use spikes, goes way, way up. Okay, so you see a process of less marijuana use, alcohol use going up. Everything pretty much plummets when they're deployed, but as you can see with the orange line, prescription drugs for pain are widely used, roughly 32%, okay? There's also some prescription drug misuse. The bottom red line indicates military personnel who are using diverted drugs, diverted opioids, okay? And you also see post-last deployment a rise in prescription drugs for anxiety and sleep, okay? Now, what's the RX drugs for pain, what's interesting about that is, again, it can easily turn into misuse. And it goes down to about 29% post-separation, meaning when we interviewed the veterans. These are 269, they had separated within 2 years, 70% minority, 15% female. So thinking about the uptick in alcohol post-separation as well as the opioid use, in many ways that's a recipe for disaster. Mixing these drugs can result in overdose. Some other readjustment challenges based on our sample, we had 53% unemployed, not in college, 61% living below the poverty line, 26.7% have had criminal justice involvement ever, and 21% since separation. As in the national population, about 20% have PTSD, screened positive for PTSD, 48% any substance or mental health issue. And it's still preliminary data, but we have 15% of veterans who are witnessing other veterans overdose. So now I turn to some of our ethnographic material, and really trying to, in these veterans' own words, what I want to talk about is let them speak for themselves about their challenges while in the military service as they also try to readjust to civilian life. I start with Joel, and when I first met Joel, he was living in a homeless shelter. He has since found stable housing. Joel enlisted in the pre-military enlistment program. Right after 9/11, he went to basic training. He was basically on the ground in 2003 in Baghdad. What follows is Joel's narrative. It was like 2 days. We had a drawn-out firefight outside of Baghdad. This is when we hit the wall. When we hit the wall, we got over. We got to the center. We were in a firefight for another day and a half, and I don't know what came around. It was in pill form, but they said it would wake you the fuck up, and sure enough, it kicked in like speed. We kept going for another 8 hours after that. We got relief. Black Hawk came in, tanks started rolling on through Bradleys. We're dumping in the back of the Bradley. I remember sitting back there like this, like wired, like I'm still in the fucking firefight, waiting for some shit to happen, but I'm inside a secure tank. It was crazy. Do they tell us what to come down on? No. Ambien, Xanax, Valium, benzos. They just tell you it'll relax you, it'll pick you up. That's all. That's all I got from my chain of command. The go, no-go pills. It was only the first 3 months. Yeah, like 45, 90 days. Several months later, when Joel was returning to get some mail in Baghdad, on our way back, shit, it's kind of funny because on our way there, we didn't see the construction. We get to the corner, it was a decoy. As soon as we turned the corner, they blew it. Right under the Bradley, rolled us over. I was in the driver's seat. I lost part of my memory and shit. I got banged around so hard, I actually blacked out. Support came in, they dragged me out. I finally just passed out. I fractured my sternum in the collision. I also caught a fracture in the back of my skull, caused TBI. And that's what caused me to lose part of my memory. I went off to Germany. I went through physical therapy for 4 months, drinking. They were giving me fucking pain pills. I was getting Percocet, Vicodin. I was getting fucking Oxycontin, Oxycodone if I fucking wanted it. And they'd give it to me, no doubt about it. I'd wake up in excruciating pain. My body was getting used to the perks. I had to go up, so he's trying to give me these 3 Oxycontin, like 40 milligram. And I was just on like a 10 milligram perk. That's a whole 30 milligram jump, especially with the Oxycontin. I looked at this shit and I'm like, dude, I get nauseous with these. I don't like it. So eventually, instead of like 4 times a day, it was like twice a day. And then that's actually what brought the tolerance back down. I would go 1 day without taking them or just take 1 throughout the day, and at the worst time of the day, and then tomorrow I'll take 1 or 2, and then after that, I might not take any. And the day after that, I might not take any either. That drug would have made me like a zombie. I would have been sitting at my desk all day. I didn't join the military for that. 4 months later, I was back in Iraq. Yeah, I had all kinds of psychological tests. I went through it and I told that psych the same thing I told that chaplain. Ain't nothing wrong with me. These motherfuckers tried to kill me and I killed them. Hoo-ha, I'm still here. See you later. I had PTSD, it's happened, but it's not to where I'm like I've fallen on the ground, rolling over, talking about grab your weapon, find my weapon. I get flashbacks. I remember it happened, I get dreams of the shit that's happened, and some fucked up dreams that shit didn't even happen. I'd be like, damn, did that happen? And I don't really know because I lost part of my memory, So I'd be like, shit, I get it, but I don't like the fucking flashbacks, No, I'm done taking the pills now. I was done with them. I could actually still get them from my doctor, but I try to deal with the pain, in different ways. Marijuana helps me now. It keeps me calm. It helps me deal. I ended with an honorable discharge, Purple Heart recipient. I'm going to go quickly into Blue. Blue is a black male growing up in California, North Carolina, and New York City. As a youth, an active member in gangs, occasional marijuana smoker, PCP user. Like Joel, he joined the military for a better life, a way to get out, to learn, to get skills. He speaks to his in-service and post-service challenges and successes. Being in the Marines, all people did was drink, but I never really liked to drink. I had an alcoholic period where I was like everyone else. A couple of people tested for pot that didn't really want to be in the military. They didn't give a shit, so they were smoking pot at lunch breaks. My knee pain kept getting worse and worse, especially with the sand. I'd seen doctors, mainly gave me codeine and Percocet, early on oxycodone. I tell them, my fucking leg hurts, like I'm really serious, my leg hurts. I feel like crying, aches and pains, So then I'm back to New York, really, really fucked up state of mind, not giving a fuck about nothing. Then there's that whole mental issue, PTSD that's developing. I'm kind of like fighting that shit off because, once I get stateside and I took that drink, oh yeah, I wasn't drinking anything that wasn't flammable. It had to be flammable. Then I had that incident on the subway with the police. It was over me being racked up because the cops were like, we're gonna search you. Make sure you don't have a weapon and all that. Fuck you, and I was dealing with PTSD. Then Memorial Day, and I'm sweating, and my wife's trying to calm me down, and people are giving me the look like, what's up with him? When law enforcement comes into play too, like having a heightened sense of masculinity, it's more like having a heightened sense of confidence in what we are trained to do. When it comes to law enforcement, and they roll up on you in the street, you're already in the mode already. I've seen a couple hands-on situations where I really had to educate police officers about PTSD. Now I manage my PTSD through cannabis use. I self-medicate. If I want to detach from any emotional or mental pain, I go smoke weed. I don't even like to drink that much. That's all we did while in. So I have the drug in the social circle. I smoke to calm down and honestly can't have a full night of sleep without it. So getting stoned gets me good before bed. The pills, I stay off them now. Don't like the feeling. So with Joel and Baloo's story, we have a lot of things going on. We have legitimized prescription drug use for performance enhancement. We have self-regulation of use. We have reduction in use. We have feelings of nauseousness. We have encounters with law enforcement, stop and frisk. These are two veterans in our study. The one thing I would like to say is the experiences are very complex. It is not necessarily a narrative of tragic sameness. They are complicated individuals. Some are doing quite well, but as our data suggests, with 32% still using opiates for chronic pain, there is that risk for adverse health consequences. I wanted to point out just one last thing too. Speaking with all the veterans we've been working with, we're trying to get a sense of, their voices. This came up earlier on. What can ethnography do for policy? Well, one of the most important things is to go to the people who we're trying to study, get the voices of veterans and let them speak to their needs, let them be a part of the policy development process. And so here we have veterans speaking to working in the VA. They have battle buddies, and what they really advocate for is a readjustment buddy, someone who you can partner with who's been out for longer than you have been. We also have buddy systems, and then I'll talk about David. Well, in terms of treatment, I know this much. I think that it starts with the staff and the size of the agency who's providing the service. I don't care how many degrees you have or experience you have. The best counselor is going to be a former addict. I would assume it'd be the same way in situations like this for veterans. So they really spoke to their involvement, and most importantly, they want to be listened to. So going back to the 3 points at the beginning of my last minute or so, there is that balancing act, and so we really need to, I think education is an important thing. Some veterans are in chronic pain and they need opioids, but as studies have been showing and others have talked about, even within VA now, despite restrictions, they are prescribing and prescribing and prescribing. I think we need more consideration into things like non-pharmacological healing, potentially medical marijuana, yoga, exercise, connecting other veterans, okay? And there's a lot of overdose prevention efforts going on in town, getting naloxone out. And DPA has done some great work with the Good Samaritan legislation. So again, alternative ways to heal. And in terms of, I think there's also targeted education we need for schools, for law enforcement, understanding about PTSD and how to interact with people, especially returning veterans, so quickly. So I'll end with finally, I'll just say that I hope at least one thing our project has done is helped connect veterans to other veterans and the agencies that service them. And I think ultimately we're hoping to help them realize how important their voices are in the development of public policy that affects them. Thanks.
All right, let's give our panelists one more round of applause. We've worked really hard up here dealing with the technological and natural difficulties that we're facing. And so we've saved a lot of time for you to ask the burning questions that have arisen for you during this panel, which is a really interesting panel in the sense that I thought it was going to have only paradoxes to offer, right? And you've gotten quite a plate full of paradoxes here. And it asks you to do a lot of work maintaining a kind of stereoscopic vision. And that is really something that each paper had in common. But they didn't have only paradoxes to offer. All of the panelists have deep and rich repositories of data that I am sure that they would like to share more of. So if you can ask the right questions, we can probably get a lot more out on the table than we were able to do in these very short papers. And so one of the things that occurs to me, and I'd like you to come up and start asking, is that you've seen some illustrations of the intense and tightly coupled interaction between legal and illegal markets, right? You've seen legal markets that breed illegal ones. You've seen the way in which a focus on junkies, on illegal markets, obscures attention to consumers in the legal market. And so let's, what are your questions about the kinds of paradoxes that these panelists have put on the table? Can you get up? I think there's recording going on, and so we actually want you running through the sound system.
My name is Shamsini, and all the presenters seem to give very laudable explanations regarding drugs. But what I'm trying to get is, what are the solutions that's going to be presented, if not here today, maybe tomorrow at the Chamber? What are the solutions to the complexities of drugs and how it has impacted the lives of people in this country?
I'll take a shot at that. Is this working? Maybe? Okay, there we go. So one thing, the note that Julie and I ended on was a gesture towards harm reduction. So what we set up in our paper was kind of a return to a prohibitionist model based on this paradox of race and place and the threat of miscegenation through prescription opioid users transitioning to heroin. And as a prescriber myself, I think that I'm against the wholesale kind of capital that goes on around opioid sales, and you may know that the United States is responsible for 80% of the world's opioid and opiate consumption. So we're just a huge world consumer, and there's a whole political economy around that we don't really have time to pick apart here, but it's significant, and it's really enabled because of this racial division and in some ways class division between the war on drugs and the other legal prescription opioid market. But at the same time, I also believe in harm reduction, including maintaining people on opioids when it is for them the best alternative to other consequences of opioid use that are quite serious. So that's one thing that I'll put on the table, and I think that by calling attention to some of the techniques that are used in the media, on the part of politicians involved in this, on the part of pharmaceutical companies, by calling attention to some of their strategies that keep other approaches like harm reduction off the table, we can return to discussions of alternatives, including harm reduction. So I just want to put that as one possible solution, and I think there's a whole host of other solutions. Tomorrow we're going to be hearing about community building and the use of the arts, and I'm actually personally engaged in those kinds of approaches as well, and they're not getting any public support. So I would love to see more attention paid to those approaches. But I think we have to start by calling attention to what some of the rhetoric is that keeps us away from those approaches and away from public support for those approaches which really do help people.
So I think, just speaking about veterans too, I mean, we want to also, I mean, people are really enduring some problems with their drug misuse. But think about the veterans too, is the question is, are the drugs the problem? Yes, for some of them are. But it's also this complex of readjustment challenges. And so I think by focusing overly just on the drugs themselves, oftentimes does deflect attention away from these larger issues. So is the drug the demon? Well, it's debatable. For some people, it really does help out. Is the criminalization of people, drug users, a problem? Yes, I think that is. But again, I think we need to expand this and look at more holistic approach, and to see that veterans are already separated within 2 years, living in homeless shelters, unable to get decent jobs, right? Unemployed, trained to kill. I don't know, maybe it makes sense that they're sometimes numbing their minds, numbing the pain, right? Not to mention the traumas they've endured, the PTSD and the TBI. So again, I think we need to always just be concerned that if we focus too narrowly on the drugs, then we tend to, again, deflect attention away from all these other things that are going on. It's easy just to say drugs are bad, right? It's a lot harder to think about the interaction of people using drugs in this larger complex of constraint and opportunity that they face.
I'd also point out, as part of a possible solution, that this program is framed around a war against drugs, but from where I sit, we're a society that very much favors mass drug use, and that we have a variety of systems for delivering drugs to people, and whether we approve of it or not, we've decided that lots of people should have access to drugs. And so one possible solution in my mind is to, if you start by acknowledging this and then just think, where are we doing a good job of providing lots of drugs to people with relatively little harm, and where are we doing a job where the way that we're providing and managing that system of drug provision is doing a lot of damage, and maybe even move towards this point of saying, okay, we've got a problem, there are problems of poverty, there are problems in cities that we sort of map onto drugs, and there's a whole bunch of people presenting today and tomorrow on how drugs are not the root cause, individuals' decisions about drugs are not these root causes. We can actually, if we break down the fundamental difference between the drugs and the medicines and think about all of these as the same kind of substances that we choose to provide to people, just think about how to do that in a caring way, in a way that helps rather and supports rather than harms, and then you gotta pursue the solution to the other problems that are the real cause of the suffering and misery.
Thanks, I really appreciated the panel. I enjoyed the media analysis, and I'm curious about your thoughts about the media depictions of white methamphetamine users that were very popular in the 2000s. Things that come to my mind are those photos of, the ravages of meth use, and the depiction of meth users as, terrible parents who are poisoning their children with toxic chemicals in the trailer park, that kind of thing, which seems a little different than how you were looking at opiate use when they're talking about, when you're talking about lost whiteness. So I was just curious if you have any observations.
Thank you. It's a great question. This one? Okay. Thanks. It's a great question. I do think that the case of meth is a I don't want to say an anomaly, but a little bit different because it is framed in the media predominantly as a white drug. I think what it has in common with some of the more negative portrayals of drug use and moral panics that we see around drugs is the demonizing of drug users. And so that's, I think, familiar to a lot of us. So the stories about meth mouth and the bad parenting, or, and this comes up every time there's a new substance or drug that hits the scene, right? There are these stories that, do people remember the bath salts, cannibal, face eater media stories? So I think that stuff's very typical. Now, I think what's going on with race is another question, and here's where class may provide some of the answer, because most of the portrayals of methamphetamine use among whites is this very sort of portrayed as rural, lower class or white working class folks that aren't measuring up to the potential of their, I would say, of their white privilege. I don't know if you
I think you hit it on the head, Julie. We were actually discussing this yesterday at a meeting about the war on drugs, that methamphetamine presents an interesting case study that we'd like to get more deeply into, because class is a distinguishing feature. Even though prescription opioids had been called, or OxyContin at many points had been called hillbilly heroin, there's also substantial suburban and upper income urban white clientele, whereas methamphetamines have really been associated with rural poverty. So that's an area we'd like to really look at as a comparison, and it fleshes out some of the complexity of race and class that the war on drugs really brings to light. So thank you for asking.
Hello. Thank you all to the panelists. definitely has my mind blown in a lot of ways, but it's actually a follow-up question to what the gentleman asked before, and sort of really being clear about how we're, identifying problems and things like that. But I'm wondering, like, what would an inclusive framework look like in terms of including appropriate race analysis or appropriate class analysis, because I think that would be helpful for me, particularly as someone who is working in various departments and working with drug users on a large scale. And so I'm thinking, like, what would the utopia look like in terms of, if we don't have a war on drugs, what would be the antithesis to that?
I'll try to respond to that. At the Drug Policy Alliance, we did a project with the New York Academy of Medicine where we went around the state of New York and asked folks that very question. What would your vision of a effective, humane drug policy look like? And the responses to that have a lot to do with the kinds of things that people here have mentioned, which is it wasn't really focused particularly on drugs, although that was a part of the conversation. It was focused on community integration, on economic development, on supportive families, good education, and not to make a shameless plug, but we wrote that work up in a report called a Blueprint for a Public Health and Safety Approach to Drug Policy in New York that tries to lay out a comprehensive framework for what a more progressive, healing drug policy might look like. And one other thing I will say about that work we did is that issues of structural racism came up in every community that we spoke to, and issues of racially biased policing as well. So clearly, whatever a visionary drug policy is, it's going to have to tackle head-on issues of racism.
Does anyone else want to speak to that question, or shall we go to the gentleman over here?
Hi, I just want to say thank you to everybody for coming here. My name is Michael. I'm a junior at the School of General Studies, and I'm also a chapter president of Students for Sensible Drug Policy. And my question is directed towards the relative immunity of Big Pharma in regards to more stringent policy. And I was wondering, where the shortfall is maybe in advocacy of more sensible policy towards Big Pharma, and even specifically, like, you see name brand OxyContin and the ability for the user, or the lack of tamper-proof that you see in name brands, and you see them coming up in generic forms of the drug, but even on that small scale, there seems to be no change in the way that these prescription drugs are presented. So, I mean, even something as simple as tamper-proof and taking the ability to use intravenously of a prescription drug might help with things like overdoses. And I was wondering if we could talk about the shortcomings in policy advocacy.
Okay, so I'm just going to start this off, and I'm going to rely on those very august members of this panel and of this audience to add to this. I mean, pharma is such a huge target, and Julie and I are in the process of trying to study up. We actually have some good contacts within pharma, but it's difficult. And they're so powerful if you think about the fact that biotechnology, including pharma, is the largest economic sector in our economy. It's huge. They're very powerful. So one thing I just want to put on the table is that we should be revealing, and as a public, really educating ourselves and putting on the political agenda the way that pharmaceutical marketing works, including the fact that there's always a timeline from the introduction of a new drug that every pharmaceutical company already knows has side effects, including addictive potential, black market trade, et cetera. They know that from the beginning. They market the fact that it's less abusable, for example. In the case of OxyContin, it was marketed in '96 as a minimally addictive opioid pain reliever. And that's what allowed Purdue to really aggressively market it among primary care physicians, largely in the suburbs and in rural areas. And then they knew they had their tamper-resistant formula ready at the point that the patent ran out on OxyContin. And then they lobbied the FDA to illegalize generics that didn't have their patented tamper-resistant formula. So they already had this planned out ahead of time. And so there's a cycle to new drugs that are introduced, and then backup plans and alternative strategies that are often racial in nature. So, for example, I believe with buprenorphine, and this is a story that Julie and I are covering now, I believe with buprenorphine that they also knew eventually buprenorphine would not be containable as a white drug, that it would eventually leak out to black and brown markets. And that's what's happening now, and that's probably why I was visited by DEA officers in my office, because there's now a crackdown on buprenorphine prescribers. And lo and behold, Reckitt Benckiser, the manufacturer of buprenorphine, just introduced an alternative formulation of buprenorphine that's now on patent, just as their original formulation is running off patent, that is quote-unquote less abusable. So I think that the more that we reveal these strategies and understand them as a public and can enter this into deliberations around things like patent policy around marketing, direct-to-consumer marketing, which was legalized in the 90s and which is responsible for tremendous uptake in prescription writing, the better. You know, it just has to be, I think, really hard work on the ground, political education and organizing, because they're incredibly strong constituency. And they really do have this figured out. It really is not a mistake that they're the biggest single sector of our economy. So we have to be prepared for a hard fight there.
I just want to talk a little bit about political coalitions and reining in pharmaceutical companies, because there have been two major moments when there were successful political coalitions that reined in very profitable drugs. One was the original back in the early 20th century when the Food and Drug Act and the Narcotic Act passed, and then again was in the 60s and 70s. And initially it can be pretty depressing to look, because what you see is there are various members of a political coalition who might be interested in reining in pharmaceuticals, like reformist physicians, activist organizations that are concerned about the public health, so on and so forth. But when they achieve success in reining in these profitable and powerful drug industry, and the prescribers who want autonomy, seems to be when there's a racialized story that can be told that can kind of push the coalition over the top, if it's about the red Chinese or if it's about cocaine-crazed African Americans in the South. But there's one counterexample, which is in the 70s when, during a time where there's a broader coalition of kind of anti-corporate or leftist activism that was able to tell a story about drug companies themselves with a political economic critique of the drug market, that was successful in reining in some of the most widely used globally and most profitable drugs, and you really saw their use decline dramatically. So on the one hand, it's kind of an unpleasant history showing that to stitch that coalition together a lot of times has taken unsavory means, but there is an example of successfully just stitching together enough different groups who are pursuing that goal to have some success. Well, she's saying, do I need Valium? It's Valium, yes, but also amphetamines and all the sedatives and stimulants. And by the way, when they're successful, the Federal Bureau of Narcotics is a drug regulatory body that when that law goes into effect, it's so successful that drug companies are knocking at the door with new narcotics that they're trying to sell as having overcome the addiction problem for 80 years before they finally break through with drugs like OxyContin. So this is actually very effective, too effective. It's hard for people to get the narcotics that they need for pain during this time period. So it's not like it's impossible. The tools that you need to control the pharmaceutical market are out there. They're not perfect, but they have and can be achieved.
The question is, how are we going to integrate all of these the spectrum of drug involvement and drug actions into recognizing that it's a single market? And I think the story of the veterans illustrates that very nicely, that everything from being, this history of amphetamines in the military to keep people awake on bombing missions and so on. And then in the face of almost universal PTSD, which I think has always been there in war, but we didn't have the same discussion about it we had before. That end of the market, a very active, vivid one, to the tobacco, of underage smoking, and the black markets that obviously easier to buy cigarettes in as loosies than in a pack at a bargain rate. And also underage marijuana use. 2 states have just legalized marijuana, but that's only down to age 21. So what are the youth markets going to look like in those states where The heaviest levels of use peak at age 21. Monthly use reaches its highest level at age 21 and declines thereafter. So a kid's going to be getting their marijuana from the stash of their parents at this point who have it legally, or are they going to be buying it from the cigarette dealers who sell untaxed cigarettes? So the desperate need is for a unified analysis of a drug market with outcomes and expectations based on public health outcomes, mortality, more the usual cast of suspects. And who's going to work on that? And if that's not us, I don't know who it will be, because everybody else in it has their axe to grind. The separate industries, the farmer and their regulatory world, the narco-trafficking states who rely on this for their revenue, who are trying to deal with this in South America now. That may be, we may have lessons to learn from them, but if we don't break through and get the acceptance so that all of this is one very human thing that's been going on a long time, it's going to go on forever, how do we make it work to our advantage rather than disadvantage as a nation and a society? So any thoughts about those?
Would you like to come up here?
I don't know.
You have a place to start.
If we don't do it, I don't know how to respond. I don't know who will do it. I think that that's part of us being here now, trying to talk together about such things. I think it is worth sort of really thinking through. I think just the one thing that I wanted to say, I don't know how else to respond to your question, but one of the things I keep thinking about today is that in terms of commonalities, is that we've got to ask the question about how people are dealing with the complications of their lives through drugs, and whether it's tobacco or alcohol or meth or whatever, that increasingly what we have in common is our humanity. And whether you pathologize neighborhoods and say that this is where the bad people are, or you pathologize people, what we have in common is that we're in some ways in crisis in our increasing individualized world and our individualized selves. And it has complications if you, for people when we don't think about it as a social problem in mostly white communities, and we individualize it, and then that pushes it underground, but then we over-criminalize black and brown spaces, and we say that that's where, all the way around, it's part of the same problem, right? And so maybe one step towards solution, which a couple of people have asked about today, is to start thinking about the commonalities. And it seems that overwhelmingly, whether we look at it from a micro level perspective or a macro, that we're talking about everybody dealing with their lives in particular in an increasingly complex, and the ways in which there is profit. I have to say that there are corporations across the board, from the criminal justice system through the pharmaceutical companies, who are making money from this misery. And as long as there's a real economy that directly benefits, and how we then become part of that, right, through at either end. And so we then contribute to keeping the system going through visibility or invisibility on either end because of that alone. I'm rambling a little bit, but we have to think about how all of this fits together, what we're all a part of that same system in one place or the other.
And all of the increasing complexity and tension and stress, it's not likely to lessen in the modern world. But fortunately, we have a drug for that.
Yeah.
Somewhere.
But I think there's also just part of that. I mean, just one more thing is it's the perceptions too of others about the drugs. I mean, one thing that struck me interviewing veterans and talking to them is, oxys, all knew about them, right? Percocet, Vikes, not a big deal. Didn't really know about the effects of mixing with alcohol, and that's a major problem. But then talking about heroin, it's like, what the hell are you talking about, right? A qualitatively different thing, right, from their perspective. But we know, right, in many ways very, very similar, right? And it's associated with, amongst veterans, some veterans we interviewed, again, sort of that stereotypical junkie, right, that Camille was discussing. And so part of this is it's using the same things and people just not realizing, what the other purpose is. And so it is this, do we want this differentness, right, to continue to divide, right, in many ways? And those are them over there, and we're over here. And they're using those demon drugs, we're using these angel drugs, right? They're the patients, we're the criminals, all these divisions. But, I think it's coming to discussions, right, to the table and trying to understand these different perspectives. But there's no, magic wand to do it. I think it's just a start through the discussions.
Just one thing to add. I do think that this is a really exciting time for people that are looking for alternative to drug policies to prohibition, which we know hasn't worked. And so I think, David was pointing to the idea that we might have something to learn from how prescription drugs have been regulated, both good and bad. But I also think we're going to learn a lot from Washington and Colorado, who have legalized marijuana for recreational use. And then there's some really interesting international things going on that I think we also could learn from, looking at Uruguay or Portugal or some of the European countries who are, frankly, much further along, I think, than we are, in reorienting drug policies focused on outcomes that improve individual, family, and community health, rather than focusing on cracking down on substances per se. And so I do think that there are models out there that we could learn from.
One thing that everyone in this room can do, since most of us will use some kind of a drug or another, is just in the way that you speak about your own drug use with other people, try to not convey those kind of dichotomies and barriers that we used to work in.
Great. I think this actually dovetails nicely with the discussion of false dichotomies. I'd like to, and it did come up when you said that the institutional racism kept on coming up when you were talking to different people, but I'd like to push this a little bit harder. David, you talked about the fundamental historical racialization in the distinction between narcotics and medicines, and you guys were talking about how we need to make whiteness visible. I'm a big fan of Tim Wise and his work around needing to make whiteness visible and the cost of it being just the default and the norm, not only to people of color, but also to whites. But I'd like to push a little harder and ask you what you would say to people like me who believe the war on drugs is working perfectly well. The war on drugs is a war against black and brown people, and it's working fantastically well. And that's my firmly held belief. So what's the response to that when we talk about what's working and what isn't working?
I think just a quick thing. It does seem that, just thinking of something like overdose, there's a lot of attention surrounding it, right? And as people have indicated, the framing of the overdose victim, right, has changed dramatically. Newspapers and things like that. I remember reading something in Pittsburgh, early 2000s, anyone's son. And it was all about white middle-class people, and it could have been anyone's son, right? I think that as horrible as it is, but as the image of the dominant image, the framing of the drug user shifts, right, to one that's more expansive, right, including people from all walks of life, then there's a slight shift in resource reallocation too, right? People tend to want to give money to help the little white kids who overdose, things like that, right? So in some ways, it's just a process that plays out, I think, through media and things like that. That image does frame, and so people are realizing that we're all affected by the drug war. So for better or worse, in one sense, I think that even something like overdose there's a lot of money going into it now. It's perceived as a big problem now, right? The rates are skyrocketing, right? But people have been dying for a long time. What was it that triggered the attention to the issue?
I think you're right, and it's also a double-edged sword. I remember a conversation with Gabriel Say where he was explaining to me how the Good Samaritan law protecting people who call 911 who are using drugs for a companion who's overdosed, that support for that law really came about among conservative politicians when suburban kids were involved in it. So it's a double-edged sword, though, in that what Julie and I are really talking about, too, is the development of this two-tiered treatment system. It's really visible in the case of Suboxone buprenorphine, that somehow the racial logics can keep intact these two separate tiers. And that's something that we'd really have to be thoughtful about in invoking white drug users, that there's also a danger of reinforcing the segregation of the current, not only drug war crackdown, but also the treatment system for addiction and dependence.
So as the kind of moderator who wishes we could go on talking about this for the rest of the afternoon, I want to say that we're going to have to take one more question, and then I think we have a break. Another, all right. So if you two gentlemen can go ahead and ask your questions, and panelists, if we could keep it short, then people will get refreshed for the next panel, okay?
Yes, thank you. How are you? My name is Five Mualim Ak. I'm with the Campaign to End the New Jim Crow. As we move forward toward advocacy within institutions of education like universities, have you produced reports on these? Have you produced lesson plans that can somewhat influence the next generation of lawyers, the next generation of journalists, the next generation of social work? Because I find it extremely difficult, besides the DPA, to have these materials available or even have in-depth presence on an academic level that will systemically affect the next generation. And if not, how do you see that being possible from each one of you from my own personal perspective? Thank you.
We do attempt to teach the next generation, but I think it's a great idea to have public education materials that are historically informed and deeply informed in the ways that this panel has been. So I'm going to take that as a goad, an encouragement to us to work on sort of public outreach kinds of educational materials, if you don't mind. And then Anajay?
Thank you. We are living in the illusion that slavery doesn't exist, not just in terms of a metaphor, but in actuality in law. The 13th Amendment says slavery and involuntary servitude is abolished, and it uses a really tricky word that says except in the case of a punishment of a crime. So slavery is here, it's present, and we have to look at it straightforward in that sense. I would invite everyone to take the Undoing Racism workshop by the People's Institute for Survival and Beyond. Not only is it an analysis where we have a commonality of definition, but it's a growing movement that's showing some real promising results. In Texas, new workers who are working in the child welfare system, in fact, have to take the course, take that workshop to give them a new lens on institutional racism. It's called the People's Institute for Survival and Beyond, the Undoing Racism workshop.
All right. Thank you for that, and let's thank our panelists. And